We are continuing in the book of Acts this morning, and we will look at the first 22 verses of the 18th chapter, continuing to follow Paul in his second missionary journey. We left him at Athens last week. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." So Paul stayed for a year and a half, teaching them the Word of God. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. This man they charged as persuading the people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be the judge of such things." So he had them ejected from the court. Then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. But Gallio showed no concern whatever. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, "I will come back if it is God's will." Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Can you remember a time that you were discouraged? I'm not talking about the kind of discouragement that happens when you're in a hurry and traffic decides to come to a stop. Kind of discouragement. If you're like me, I watched one of my grandsons play on his little basketball team, and they lose a lot. I'm talking about the kind of discouragement that happens when something that you've been counting on and has been very important suddenly disappears. When the job that you've had for so long and wish to continue suddenly gets taken from you. From the job that you know you've been promised and is waiting for, all of a sudden no longer appears. I'm talking about the kind of discouragement that happens when someone in your family does something that just shakes you to the core, and you wonder how in the world they can ever recover from it. The kind of discouragement that happens when you just watch a dream, a hope, a wish for your future, something you've been counting on and thinking about for years, suddenly just goes up in smoke. Kind of discouragement that happens when a friend who you considered your closest confidant turns out can't really be trusted after all. That kind of discouragement. I ask you that question because, quite simply, I need you to understand that that's what we're dealing with in Paul at this point in his time. Think about it a minute. You remember, he goes off on his second missionary journey. He and Silas, their stated purpose at the beginning was to check on all the churches and see how they were doing that they founded in their first missionary journey. And in doing so, they find things. They pick up Timothy as a cohort. Things are going well. They move a little bit sort of north, mostly following the coastline, not too far on the coast, but not very far inland either, because God keeps kind of telling them not to go into Asia, not to go more inland. And finally, as they get far enough north, Paul has a vision that says, in the guise of a man from Macedonia, to come over and help us. And he concludes that that's God's way of telling him they need to go to Macedonia. And they go, first entering Philippi. There, great things happen. Well, except for the fact that they're thrown in jail, beaten with rods, and summarily kicked out of the city. So they go down to Thessalonica. And there the Jews are just rascals to the point where they don't like what they're saying. And because they won't leave, they effectively hire a mob of ne'er-do-wells to make things difficult and chase him out of the city. And he goes 30 miles further to Berea or thereabouts. And they're a little bit more polite, but the folks in Thessalonica hear that they're still in the area, and they send the mob down there to drive them out of Berea, which he does. And he lands in Athens. And Athens is the cultural center. It's New York and Los Angeles all together in one place. And there, they're politely interested to talk about anybody that has a new idea, until it challenges the ideas that they hold dear, and then they dismiss him politely, ignoring him. And then he's got a 50-mile walk to Corinth. And he's on his own. What do you suppose he's thinking during that 50-mile walk? Well, I think it's fair to assume he's discouraged. And discouragement works awful in your life. Let me tell you what it does to you. First of all, it's personal. Where have I failed? What have I done wrong? Every failure is a failure of me. And so there must be something wrong with me. What was it that Thomas Edison said when asked about his failures? He said, I didn't fail. I just found 10,000 ways that it won't work. I'm telling you, when you get to 9,999 ways of it not working, you sort of think of yourself as a failure. Second, remember this. Don't ever forget this. We think of Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles, but where did he go? Every time he entered a new place, he went to his people. He went to the synagogue, the people that he knew and he loved, the people that shared the faith with him, with news about their faith. And they almost always rejected him. The people with which he most identified were now becoming his biggest enemies. Third, like it always happens, when you get discouraged, you easily forget the successes that have happened. What about that miraculous escape, non-escape, and conversion of the jailer in Philippi? What about the people that did believe? What about those? Do you suppose Paul is thinking about those as he's walking? I don't think so. I think he's like you and me, thinking, why am I ever in this position? What's wrong with me, and why don't things go better? We so easily forget and focus on the negative. Fourth, he's beginning to wonder if he needs to kind of rebrand, change techniques, try a different style. This isn't working. Wonder what will. You know, when he wrote to the church at Corinth, this is where he said, by the time I got to you, I decided I wasn't going to do anything but preach Christ and Him crucified. Perhaps a rebranding effort, perhaps not. Fifth, this is what happens in discouragement. You come to expect it. Didn't work the last time. Why would I expect it to work this time? After all, I'm a failure. And without success, I don't have any roadmap to success. And that leads to number 6, which is we give up. Or at least we retire from this anyway. The most important thing that I learned in seminary, 3 years of schooling, and if I had just gone to the commencement exercises, this is where I heard this, at the end of those 3 years, and a preacher said this, I would have gotten the most important thing I learned in seminary for free. He said this. He said, if you don't want to quit the ministry every day, at least once, you're probably not worth your salt. And what he was saying wasn't that the ministry is terribly horrible and that nobody can stand it. What he was saying is that if it matters to you, there's going to be times that you're terribly discouraged because it's not working out like you want it to. And finally, you remember this from experiencing God? If your discouragement goes on long enough and loud enough, you come to a crisis of belief. Just can't imagine that life can continue. Let me tell you a little story. May of May of 2007, a new church in Walker County, Georgia, named Hope Fellowship, had its first preview service. We were doing monthly services through the summer. Give a chance of people to come and kick the tires. We had started with the Go Big notion from the church planters group out of Saddleback. People there had bought into it. We had spent a ton of money advertising. We had given things away. We had done just tons of things. People had heard of this new church that was going to start. We had, I want to say, between 120, I can't remember exactly, between 120 and 150 people that showed up for the first service preview. We stayed above 100 to 100. I think we were at 120 probably average for the next 3 monthly services, May, June, July, and August. The Sunday after Labor Day in September, we kicked off like a real church and met every week. And we did not expect that all 120 would show up. The truth of the matter is, if you keep, 60 to 75% of those folks that come to check it out, you're doing quite well. And that's about where we were, maybe a little more than that. We were plowing along, expecting momentum to grow. In October, we noticed that attendance was going down. And we thought, well, we'll get towards Christmas, that's when everybody goes to church, and they'll pick back up. And in November, it kept going down. And I can remember one Sunday in about the middle of November when we had 40-something people. And we had built this church on the Go Big mentality, which meant the budget was big as well. And we knew this could not sustain us. And I'm beginning to wonder what's going to happen. And I just finally decided that, Christmas comes late in Walker County, I guess. Maybe they'll come to church in December, because they sure aren't, and continued not to throughout November. And it stayed the same, maybe a little worse, throughout December. And by the new year, I was thinking, all right, we have made a serious mistake here. What do we do from this point? Discouragement. It happens. And the crisis of belief for the people of faith eventually is what comes. What I'm trying to say is discouragement at all levels is a part of life, I guess, unless you're Donald Trump. I'm a basketball fan, particularly a college basketball fan. So I enjoyed watching my beloved University of Kentucky Wildcats avenge a very severe defeat from earlier in the year last night. But I want you to hear this from what some would consider to be the best basketball player that ever played the game. He says this: I missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed. That's one Michael Jordan, and those inspirational type quotes are great. Just keep at it, keep after it. Every salesman in the world knows this. Just double down and go for it. But we are people of faith, and we believe in more than hard work. We believe that our work is for the one who authors all of our successes. And just as it was true for Paul, so it's true for us. And what's going on in this passage is God helping Paul in his discouragement. Let's take a moment to look. Number one, there is Aquila and Priscilla. And they're important in 3 ways. Number one, they're people. They're people. From the very beginning, God said it is not good for the man to be alone. We are communal beings. When you get discouraged, it's very easy to withdraw. It's the worst thing you can do. Not only are they people, they're new people. And that breaks the monotony. That gets a new voice into your life. All your friends can commiserate with you until they get tired of commiserating with you because you won't respond. A new person doesn't know that you're in such a mess. They'll just expect you to act normal. And the third thing that's true about them is that there are 2 of them, which doubles the chance of successful encouragement. God always uses people when you're discouraged. Second, there are successes amongst all the things that are discouraging. Points of light, if you will, in the darkness of failure. What's worth celebrating amidst all this rubble in Corinth? Did you get this? The synagogue doors effectively closed to them. Okay, they became abusive. Where did they go? Did you catch that? Next door. And who did they take with them? The ruler of the synagogue. You think God has a sense of humor? You folks who were around at the beginning of what became New Beginning Church, I've heard this story so many times. We were standing in the parking lot after we were summarily kicked out of the old church. What would have happened if God had given you the building next door and taken the preacher or some other leader with you? Wow! God didn't choose that path for us. But He did for Paul. Can you imagine how that just really nettled the Jews and made it all the much more difficult to speak to them? Signs of success are there. Not to mention that all along the way there's a few Jews and many Greeks who did believe. Number 3, a renewed vision. Look closely at what is said here. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. Let's just break it down as quickly as I can. You've got to hear this. Do not be afraid. What God is saying to Paul is, you know what? A more perfect love dispels the fear that you think is greater. 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. This is the basic grace of God, knowing that you're loved. And whenever you have fear, it is rooted, trust me, it is rooted in that you've forgotten that. You lack that knowledge. Paul's fear, of course, was that the continued success would just bring greater hostility. He needed to know that he was loved for who he was, not what he was doing. Second, courage is replacing caution. Keep on speaking, the vision says. Do not be silent. It's only when you have an unconditional love that you know you have that can this happen. Full speed ahead regardless of the circumstances or the consequences. Because you get into what God is doing in the world. And when you put yourself in that position, and I've heard it from so many ones here, when you put yourself in the position that only God can save you, guess what happens? God saves you. That's the way it works. Over and over again, God comes to the rescue, does something that you didn't expect. But only when you get to the point where He's the only one that can rescue you. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. Third, Paul is given an abiding presence in the midst of all this that's perplexing. God says, for I am with you. He doesn't say, I'm going to fix all your problems. He doesn't say, I'm going to convert all the Jews. He doesn't say, I'm going to keep those people from being so mean to you. He says, I'm with you. Which is exactly what He said to Job. When Job had lost his family and everything he had, and he wanted to know why, what the answer he got is, I am with you. And that was the answer that satisfied. All of his friends' explanations did not. Problem analysis is a good thing, but it's scary without a sense of God's presence. Fourth, He's promised unlimited help against all that's going to hurt him. And no one is going to attack you and harm you. Now, hear what he says. He didn't promise freedom from attack. He promised freedom from harm. But Paul is harmed later in his ministry. Well, perhaps God was just speaking about Corinth, but I think there's more to it than that. I think God was reminding him that his most precious thing, his eternal safety, was not going to be threatened. Even though Paul felt he'd had enough, God was telling him, you're not ever going to face more than you can bear. And finally, he's given the freedom of being alone, because he has the fellowship of Christ's friends. Because I have many people in this city, the vision said. God always uses people, Silas, Timothy, and Luke at least in this case, but there were many other people in that city. All those who heard his message and received it with joy. And they honored Paul, and they honored his message. But there was one who would become the least expected ally of all. That's the fourth and final way in discouragement that God helps us all, as He helped Paul today. And that sometimes He just intervenes in the affairs of men in ways that we can't explain. It becomes a God thing. Who was the God thing in this story? Gallio. Gallio didn't know he was serving God's purpose, but he was. He was only in Corinth for a year or so. Less time than Paul was. But when this came to a boil, and they drag him to the court, it's Gallio that is God's instrument to save his apostle by saying, look, this dispute doesn't rise to the level of being in court. Get out of here. Sometimes God intervenes in the affairs of men. It's only a God thing. And as a result, Paul remains in Corinth yet for some time, above the year and a half, I think. Now, do you suppose by this time had God completely dispelled and conquered the discouragement that Paul felt? I think that's unlikely. But here's what Paul was able to do. He was able to keep on keeping on, to do what God had sent him there to do, no matter what. The rest of the story is about Paul traveling back to home. But along the way, there's something that happens. He cuts his hair. And Luke tells us it's because of a vow he'd taken. And so what he's telling us is that Paul had taken the Nazirite vow 30 days prior to this, sometime when he was in Corinth. The Nazirite vow goes back in the Old Testament days. It was a lifetime vow in which one would abstain from all things that were alcoholic in content and shave the head. By Paul's day, it was a 30-day vow. Paul was on his way to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival, not sure which one at this point. He had made this vow in Corinth. It affirmed his Hebrew heritage. And after the 30 days, he cut his hair. He would bring it as a sacrifice to Jerusalem. But it was just his way of saying thank you to God. Thank you for getting me through this time. Thank you for not leaving me in the place that I had to be on that 50-mile walk from Athens to Corinth. Even when things are rough as they can be for Paul, yet there is reason to give thanks to God. Do you think that God would do any less for you? I think not. I think God will do all for you. Praise be to God. Amen.